It's been a great pleasure coming back for the second session. And then before on the outset itself, I like to thank all the delegates and faculty who joined last time and made our first session a great success. Wonderful meeting it was. And then I personally welcome all the faculty here. It's been a great faculty I could manage, the panelists and the speakers. And we will have first session, we tend to have 45 minutes on difficult or challenging ASDs. We'll have our own, starting with Dr. Saurabh from Alder Institute. He was from DM from Chitra and then is in the faculty in Alder Institute. He will be presenting on the deficient rim one case, followed by Dr. Neeraj on multiple ASDs. Dr. Neeraj is from Max Institute, the chief pediatric cardiologist. Then you have the third speaker, none other than Dr. Krishnamurthy, HOD from Chitra, my institute where I was trained. He was my teacher. And then we have fourth, Dr. Ajit Pillai, HOD and professor at JIGMA, Pondicherry, coming up with Rodenbacher syndrome, and we'll discussion on elderly and disease associated with older patients. And finally, we have Sudeep Verma from KIMS Hospital, Hyderabad, talking us about embolization. After which we have a discussion going on for 30 minutes, followed which we have Dr. Srinivas coming from, he is our great interventionist now in Jupiter Hospital, Mumbai. He will have a case followed by Dr. Srinath from Vijayawada, Ramesh Hospital and Udayananda Hospital. And we'll have final case by Dr. Anand, Associate Professor at Jayadeva Institute on the middle aortic syndrome. So to moderate the whole session, I would invite Dr. Bharat Dalvi, none other than he's a stalwart. I don't think he needs any introduction. Prior to going to him, I just want to introduce our panelist, Dr. Amitabh Chandrabhaya. Everybody knows about him. He's in Narayana in Kolkata. And our overseas panelist, Dr. Chandramani, I think is known to many cardiologists here in this part of the world. And he's a director and HOD of SGNHC Hospital in Nepal. So welcome all. And I will ask Dr. Bharat Dalvi to take over for the session.
Good evening, friends, and thanks, Edwin, for giving me this opportunity. And without wasting much time and without any ado, may I invite Saurabh to make his presentation on ASDs with rim deficiencies. Over to you, Saurabh.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So as we have said, the panel, I'll just say that I'm honored to be part of this session and to join with the people who are sitting over here. Many of them are much more experienced than me. Rather than using a single case, I thought that I'll provide an overview of deficient rims, and I hope I'll do justice to what is given to me. So this is how we name the rims, and I'm sure people who are listening are well aware that these are the rims, and we define them also according to the area and the structures which they are adjacent to. Now, these are the four views in which TE assessment is done for the rims. Now, what do we say? When do we say that the rim is deficient? If the rim is less than 5 millimeter and it is not so sturdy. When we have a deficient rim, it is not just that rim which is important. It is the overall status of interatrial septum and other rims which is extremely important. And with regards to deficient rim, I feel 1 plus 1 is 11, and it's not 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So if you have more than one deficient rim, your troubles are much more than what you would anticipate otherwise. And deficient rim is not equivalent to absent rim, except in the case of aortic region. We all know that almost 60% of the patients of ASD have one or the more rim deficient. Out of these, 20% at least have deficiency of areas other than the aortic rim. And that is why we need to know why this is very important to understand this subset of ASD with deficient rims. Now, the initial experience came quite early, 2009, where out of the 12 cases, 4 patients required upsizing of the device, 2 patients still had residual flow, and we know that these subsets are quite difficult. There are some suggestions where people have faced a lot of challenges in such cases, especially infero-posterior rim deficiency, where in this paper, out of 18 patients, 4 failed, major complication in 6, and the authors went on to say that this cannot be recommended. The device closure cannot be recommended in this group of patients. However, they also reported one interesting case where by putting this such device, IVC was actually routed to the left atrium and the patient presented later with cyanosis. Very unusual, but a cause of concern in these patients. But much important data comes from this paper from Japan, which compared how the sufficient rim group fares with a single deficient group, which means aortic deficiency, compared to multiple rim deficiency. And what it tells is that most of the defects which are in the multiple group deficiency are larger. Their success rate is 86% compared to 98 and 100% in the other groups. And more importantly, when they looked these patients on the follow-up, they found that on the intermediate term outcome, if the patient has received a successful ASD device, then it does not matter whether the patient had deficient or a sufficient rim. So the lessons learned from these papers are that defects are usually large when the rims are deficient. Device deployment is not straightforward. Isolated deficiency of aortic rim is manageable. Chances of technical success are relatively lower, but once successful, intermediate term outcomes are good. Now, when we go for pre-procedural planning for any such case, we have to define all the rims, location and extent of rim deficiency. And what do we mean by extent of rim deficiency? So we have to look at the arc of deficiency. It is just not sufficient to look at the small area and say whether it is sufficient or deficient, and always look at the other areas which are usually associated. Like, for example, if you are dealing with posterior inferior deficiency, then always look for the superior posterior rim, which if it is deficient will be causing a lot of challenges during the procedure. Ensure counseling is adequately done and surgical support may be sought if is available. Now, even if you deal with any patient where you are suspecting deficient rim, always go for 360-degree evaluation of the defect, because defect may be lying something like this, where in this section you may find posterior rim is good, but in the other sections it may not be so, and you may miss the deficiency and may end up in trouble. And these are some examples where posterior rim is deficient. There can be additional small defect, which if it is not identified, can be a concern post-device deployment and evaluated. Now, this is about the IVC rim. Non-visualized is not equivalent to, especially if it is IVC, and this was elegantly shown in previous papers from Dr. Krishna Kumar and his group, that if you do retroflexion, then by taking away the TE probe from the esophagus, you can show smaller rims, which can then be, the patient can become suitable for device closure. While if you have not done this maneuver, then maybe you will label this patient as absent IVC rim. No, so if you are dealing with any patient who is having suspected deficient rim, then it is better to draw imaginary defect in on paper and then start proceeding for any device closure. A word of caution, or from my personal experience, is that apart from the aortic rim and the SVC rim, it is the region of between the aorta and the SVC which is sometimes deficient and is not generally picked, because we use only 4 views on TE, and sometimes this deficiency creates a lot of trouble in terms of poor deployment or slight malposition, which may lead to embolization in the early course of following the device. So once we are dealing with deficient rims, have at least 2 sizes higher on the shelf. Device deployment may not be straightforward, so ensure availability of all the hardwares and ask for help whenever available. Now, coming to the rims, deficient mitral rim is generally exclusion for device closure because it reaches into the vestibular region, and here this case would be a case where a device should not be done. But in another case where the defect is lying mostly superiorly, a defect of this kind where the mitral rim is relatively small may still be suitable for putting a device in. Now, if it is aortic rim deficiency, then there are many maneuvers which can be done, including Greek maneuvers, LUPV deployment, and there are assisted methods like using wire, catheter, balloon assistance. You can use a cut sheath to make the device coming perpendicular to the IAS so that it comes and we have less prolapse across the deficient aortic rim. If it is a posterior superior rim deficiency, then LA roof deployment is quite useful. And if that doesn't work, then we can take an assistance of balloon. The balloon placement and the device placement position can be changed according to the deficiency of the rims. Deficient IVC rim generally can be taken care of by larger devices. It's more important to assess the device position after the device deployment, because the device cable also interferes with visualization. TTE sometimes may be useful more than TE, and TE with retroflexion, as has been highlighted, can be used to assess this. This I have already highlighted, that from my own experience, I feel that the deficiency in the aorto SVC region should also be carefully seen in any such patient. Once the device is done, in any such case where the IVC rim is deficient, then the careful assessment is mandatory, and any residual flow like this should mandate a very individualized kind of judgment before the device is released. After the device deployment, Minnesota wiggle is not a foolproof method, and people have got the device embolized after a successful push or pull maneuver. And therefore, I would suggest that this should not be taken as a marker of device stability. Rather than that, it may be used to define the status of rims between the RA and LA disc. Once you pull the device, then it is better visualized on TE. Now, in the post-procedure, if the device is large, then if it is in a posterior deficiency, cardiac erosion is a real possibility. So I would think that individualized careful follow-up is mandatory in all these patients. The good news is that all these patients who have large devices encroaching upon to the adjacent structures on long-term follow-up have been shown that the device does not reach as much.
Saurabh, can you conclude, please?
Yes. So to conclude, deficient rims poses challenges in device closure of ASD. Meticulous imaging and planning is the key to success. Technical success is less than with the sufficient rims. Outcomes are good if device closure is done successfully, and it mandates careful follow-up. So hope for the best, plan for the worst should be the key for any patient with deficient rims in ASD. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Saurabh, for that great presentation, and sorry for hurrying you up because of the time issues. So we'll move on to the next speaker, and Neeraj is going to speak on multiple ASDs. Over to you, Neeraj. Keep it to 5 minutes, please. Neeraj, you are muted.
Neeraj, you are not audible.
Am I audible now? Hello.
Now audible.
Yeah, sorry, I was mute. I directly come to the topics. I'll be talking about multiple ASD steps in the multiple ASD device closures. We have this 14-year-old. The case would speak for itself. A 37.5 kg male who had recurrent episodes of lower respiratory infections. Poor weight gain, was diagnosed ASD on transthoracic echo and was referred for evaluation. He had a 16 millimeters with an additional 8 mm ASDs, dilated RARV, normal PA pressures, normal coronaries, and normal left-sided inflows with normal function. Most of the time, learning one, a simple ASD view may not tell you that there is an additional ASD. Look at the two-dimensional on the left side, where it is showing multiple drop-ups. But as I put color on the right side, the ASD is small. Actually, this patient was referred to us as an 8 millimeter ASD, but RA particularly when the septum is aneurysmal to look for additional ASDs. Yes, we measure the septal length. Particularly, I am not a very strong proponent of a septum because of septal length. We can always discuss it. Septum is not a single plane structure. It is in different planes. So whenever assessing a multiple ASDs, it is a good idea to assess where your ASD is, as Saurabh has rightly demonstrated the whole septum, whether it is in which plane. We have this additional ASD. We saw the additional the ASD in the lower part of the septum. This is just an anterior tilt with the aneurysmal septum with the ASD which is sitting just much far away in the different plane. And the septum being aneurysmal, look at the same ASD which is stretched to almost 16 millimeters when we measured it in a different plane. So it's a good idea that for a multiple ASDs, we have all our ASDs defined. There is a possibility of more than 2 ASDs, but we have to define that what is the interseptal distance, what is the inter-device distance IDD between the various ASDs, whether it is 7 millimeters, what will be the device interference among them. This is important to decide. So once we have taken a decision, TE is a very important resistance because T helps us to decide that which ASD we are crossing. I'm sorry, I don't have a T image of this particular case, but even our positioning of the catheters in 2 different planes and passing a wire across between them helps better visualization on a TE. These 2 ASDs were placed in pulmonary veins. The sheaths were parked. The usual ASDs were taken across and they were deployed almost simultaneously. One ASD is being deployed, and if the rims are whether a support, am I audible? Hello?
Yeah, you are audible.
Audible.
Breaking.
You are audible.
So we divide. Yeah. So this particular case, a device was deployed, and then the other ASD device was deployed. Since the and if you look, the other ASD is in fact the distance was 8 millimeters, and they are in 2 separate planes. Fluoroscopy may not be very suggestive, but TE is very, very important whenever you're deploying a 2 ASDs. Why I say so? That I will. This is the final fluoroscopy. I will exemplify from the other ASD. Now this is another ASD which is very close. The 2 ASDs are one is almost 18 millimeters and the other is 11 millimeters. But here, look at carefully. I am taking the support of the other device because the inruceptum in between was so aneurysmal. Here, the smaller device is deployed first, and the rim of that particular smaller device is being supported to deploy the other device. So if I have to compare both the discs, both the cases, the first device, good interceptal distance, they were in 2 different planes. Here, echo should have been shown, and echo is a very important part of the planning. But here, millimeters, it was very floppy and aneurysmal. So a decision was taken to deploy the smaller device first, utilizing a rim of the device to seat onto the other devices, just as we do all the supportive measures. The other device was deployed. So once we deploy this device, how the device is entangled is being demonstrated here. If there are multiple ASDs, carefully choose the most central defect. Many of the time, that is aneurysmal defect. Multiple ASDs are very close to each other. Cross it through the central defect, and a criform if ASD can well make the things easy. To summarize, a single device when there is a large device and a smaller adjacent device, good inter-device distance, maybe more than 7 millimeters because that is one of the rim of the device. 2 separate devices independent of each other, which may be deployed simultaneously or may be deployed sequentially. Perforated multiple devices, like the third case I have shown, cross through the smaller S defect and try to measure the disc of the cribriform device so that we account for all the other devices. Small ASDs less than 3 millimeters, which I would label small, can be easily left. We can always discuss about it. And the last case where the inter-device distance is less than 7 millimeters and we might require the support, and it's aneurysmal, or is aneurysmal even more than 7, we might require the support of the other device. Deploy the device which is more appropriate and which will give the support first, and then deploy the other device, taking its support to devise the other device. I have made these 4 approaches based on this particular paper on multi-hole secundum ASD approach closures. This particular paper talked of surgical deployment of ASD devices from China, and where they divided into type A, B, C, and D, and then they did a percutaneous device closures of all these defects. I'm open to discussion in the end. Thank you. learning points. Multiple ASD is a feasible option. Planning is the most important step. Look at the inter-device distance, aneurysm is there, target ASD and its rim, and what support is going to give to the other ASD. T is very helpful, particularly when deploying, because you know which hole you are crossing through. Monitor the change in orientation post-device, because if it is taking one of the support of the other device, you expect some amount of orientation change which will happen. But do always look at the T, whether rims are still inside. Of course, in our setup, financial implications remains a major deterrent for multiple ASD device closures. Thank you.
Thanks, Neeraj. Let's move on to the next talk by Professor Krishnamurthy on ASD closure without fluoroscopy. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat Dalvi, and thanks to Dr. Edwin also for giving me this opportunity. We'll see how ASD can be closed without fluoroscopy. First, we'll see what is the logic for this. The bottom line of any procedure, any structural heart disease intervention is imaging. One has to see the defect or the lesion, the surrounding structures, how your intervention will affect the surrounding structures, and what intervention you are doing. All these should be visualized. The different stages of ASD closure, like patient selection, procedure itself, the post-procedure assessment, and what are the problems possible, follow. Everything requires imaging. And fluoroscopy, echocardiography for all of us is complementary. It all depends on how much we use either of these. We know radiation has its hazards. We all know that patient is exposed, but we seldom or very infrequently note that the operator, the staff, and the imagiologist are also exposed. The point is that in these persons, the exposure is on a professional basis the whole lifetime, every day, and it is cumulative. And invasive cardiologists nowadays have the highest level of radiation in the medical field, what with all those complex interventions now coming. Another point is that in ASD, 83% of the patients are below 18 years who are the most vulnerable for carcinogenic effect. And this effect is more cumulative in a growing child. When you close ASD or PDA in a young child, they have a very long lifespan to manifest these stoichiometric effects. That is why we have to prevent radiation hazards in these children. It is well known, or at least documented by theoretical application, that 1 in 6,000 patients with closure of ASD, if it is boys, and in 1 in 2,000 girls will have cancer, estimated, although long-term data is not yet available. So what we do with non-fluoroscopic technique is that we use TEE routinely under GA, and we do a prospective study. Every step is done under TEE. There is no blind maneuver. Very slow and extremely careful maneuvers. If any part of the procedure or any step is not visible by TEE, we go to fluoro. If the patient weight allows, there is a luxury of 3D TEE. We cannot do this procedure when other procedures like CAG or balloon valvotomy or other lesions, or if there is hemodynamic studies required, or in sick patients, we do not do this procedure. This is an example of a pre-procedure echo of a patient who underwent this fluoroblast procedure. Now, I just want to highlight how this catheter is crossing the ASD. Just notice at this point, this is the same patient, fluoro and angio. See at this point how the catheter just pokes. See the same patient, when we see on echo, see how dramatic this, see that movement. But this movement is not visible on fluoroscopy. At least it is not highlighted. This is another wire crossing which we do very often. This is acceptable. But when we see this violent movement on fluoro echo, you see same patient. See how violent it is. In other words, what I want to highlight is this echocardiographic visualization very sensitive for even the smallest movement. That is what I want to highlight, which we thought is innocuous in fluoroscopy is not so. And we put the wire, we pass the wire through the ASD and park the wire in the left upper pulmonary vein or in the left atrium, which is free appendage, or in the right upper pulmonary vein. Wire may sometimes go through the right upper pulmonary vein, which we accept. We'll come to that point later. Now we generally pass the sheath like this also. Do you think it is safe? It is not. We do not know what structure is here. But whereas this is how we cross the sheath across the wire, across the ASD over the wire. See, the tip can be visualized. It's very careful. We know where, even by a millimeter of the distance, we know where it is. So it is very safe. Then the wire is removed. Now the sheath is seen. You can see the double barrel, the barrel type of sheath, which is translucent. And now sheath is now in the left upper pulmonary vein in this patient. If required, we inject the saline contrast to see the sheath tip free in the LA. And then the device will enter. When the device enters, we see that the translucent sheath becomes radio opaque, not radio opaque, echo opaque. You can see this. Now the deployment takes place. Now, at this point, the sheath tip has to reach the device. Then only we will know it is close enough so that unscrewing can be done. Otherwise, it can just fly off. It can damage. Now, if there is any doubt of the position of the sheath, at this point, we inject saline to see that it's close to the device. And then we unscrew. And because of the memory shape of the device, it takes its normal position, the desired position. And post-procedural assessment is done. After that, this is the usual protocol. Now, do we face problems? Yes, sometimes we can. We'll see what are the problems we can face. See, device can slip. It's of course connected to the cable. But then, what do we do? Once the device slips, do we go to fluoro? No. It can be retrieved. I'll show how it is retrieved. Now, if prolapse, so the device can occur. Do we go to fluoro? No. Again, we can retrieve the device. We'll see how. In this patient, the retrieval is done in the LA. Very carefully, we can see the slenderizing of the device, left atrial disc, and then taking it into the sheath.
Dr. Krishnamurthy, 1 minute to go.
Yes, I will finish in half a minute. This is it. We saw that the sheath is kept in the right upper pulmonary vein, and the device can be deployed in the right upper pulmonary vein also. Unscrewing can also be done in the right upper pulmonary vein position. This is what we call alignment of the device across the aorta. Many of these patients, when there is prolapse, we have to go to either assisted delivery or some form of maneuvers. But in this patient, when there is echo-guided procedure, we can carefully place the device to and with manipulation so that this alignment can be obtained properly without prolapse. So in these patients, when echo-guided procedure is used, we have avoided REPV or assisted delivery in many of these patients. So conclusion is that fluoroscopy can be avoided, very short duration in this patient. In fact, puncture to hemostasis is only 10 minutes in our patients. Patient safety is not compromised. Initially, it was the surgeon's eye and then became the fluoroscopic eye. Now it is a TEI. X-rays will prove to be a hoax, Lord Kelvin said more than 110 years ago. But then we say X-rays will prove to be redundant. Thank you, Dr. Edwin, and all the listeners. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Krishnamurthy, for this novel approach, although not all that novel these days, but still quite novel to most of us in this country. I think we'll move on to the next speaker, Dr. Ajit, will be presenting a case of Lutembacher syndrome. Over to you, Ajit.
Thank you. Not take 2 more presentations. Then half an hour discussion. No questions, sir.
We can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, very well. And we
Yeah,
can see the
thank you.
screen as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mani. Without wasting time, I will present my topic. I'll be discussing about transcatheter treatment for Lutembacher syndrome, which is not a very common entity for us. But we have some experience with some cases, so we will be just discussing those cases. So it's a relatively rare disease. We have seen about 17 cases in the last 10 years. This is overall cases we have seen. Careful case selection is key, needless to say in this audience. Often the mitral stenosis is advanced. So it's just not like a regular BMV we do in mitral stenosis populations. Because of the decompressing effect of the atrial septal defect, the mitral stenosis often comes to the clinical attention in a delayed fashion. So probably these patients do have, henceforth have advanced valvular disease. So that is one challenge with regard to balloon mitral valvuloplasty. Severe pulmonary arterial hypertension is the norm. So usually, because they come very late in their natural history, severe pulmonary arterial hypertension usually becomes a norm in these patients. And severe RARB dilatation with huge cardiomegaly. We all learned in our undergraduate days that this is one case where you get massive cardiomegaly. So the challenges as an interventionist is basically a good commissurotomy. It is not like a regular commissurotomy. You have to get a good valve area, and that too without a significant mitral regurgitation before closing the ASD. So here a successful BMV without causing significant MR before crossing ASD is very important, because redo valvotomy through the device is not possible. We don't do that, and very important to clearly document the success. Even if you've done a BMV successfully, it's very difficult to document the success of BMV, because we know that there is an ASD which is going to decompress the LA pressure. So it's regular LA-LV pressure gradients don't really matter here. We can close with the balloon, we can close with the device, but still we all know that how difficult it can be to get an accurate pressure point. So, and again, ASD ASD has to be deviceable. So that is another challenge in this particular subgroup of patients. So I'll talk about the first representative case. This is a patient who has she has come very sick, actually very sick with heart failure and NYHA class 3, then CART class 4. She has atrial fibrillation and a typical RHT heart failure presentation. And she had documented severe mitral stenosis with the large ASD. So this is an echo picture showing mitral area about 0.7 and mean valve gradient about 8, because she was in slow atrial fibrillation because of digoxin therapy. She has significant pulmonary arterial hypertension as well. So this patient actually had a large ASD, which is 32 to 29 millimeter, but her rims were adequate. So the procedure, some of the differences, unlike a regular balloon mitral valvuloplasty, no transeptal access required. So, not transeptal puncture required. So we just go in and then we do a balloon mitral valvuloplasty. One technical challenge would be to just position the device. Normally, when you do BMV, you have the balloon which is anchored into the septum after septal dilatation. But here, that kind of an anchorage is not available. So we keep the stillet right up to the balloon. Still, we enter the LV and pull back and balloon dilatation. So the Acura balloon stillet or the NIV balloon stillet should be still inside till you go in and dilate the balloon, because we don't have that supported across the transeptal or the septal plane. So that is one different thing which we do. So this patient, we did a 24 millimeter Acura balloon. We always keep a picture in the left ventricle. So that is something we do routinely in our center. So you can see the balloon pop-off sign that's probably indicative of a good commissurotomy. Actually, she had good commissurotomy. She had a area about 1.98, which is surprising to us. But we should understand that she had subvalvular disease. This valve area is at the commissure plane. And the pressure gradient dropped, which is from 8 to 3.7. So interesting thing is actually starts from now, because we have now echo is showing a good valve area, but again, we have to know what is be the impact of closing this ASD in these patients. These patients often have RV dysfunction also, so we really have to be absolutely sure as to we don't do any damage to the patient's overall well-being, and that we don't actually create more damage. So here, as a policy, we keep Swangans here, and we try to occlude the ASD. In this case, the balloon occlusion was not quite successful. As you could see in the echo images, the balloon keeps plopping off, and we could not achieve a complete obliteration. So here, what we did is we just went ahead and placed the device. Device placement was difficult. Initially, we tried with the 34 mm, it just collapsed. Then we took a 36 mm device, and then with the balloon assistance. Again, there were some challenges. You could see the balloon is more into the left atrium. We had difficulty in placing the balloon. I had to push the balloon a little bit into the left atrium to get a stable anchorage to the device. So that we did. And 36 actually sat well. We got good catch in the echo. And then we started measuring the LV EDP with the Swangans. You can see the balloon is inflated. So, and then we meticulously measure. We really meticulously measure. I like somebody who's having, somebody who's having an elevated EDP, like we meticulously measure. So this is the echo picture. This is a 34 coming out with a balloon. Yeah, so this is a 36 actually, which is catching the rims. So we actually waited for about 15 minutes. Usually we wait for about 15, 20 minutes. Even in cases where there is some grading, we liberally wait for half an hour with proper ACT monitoring, and then make sure that the gradients still remain substantially low. So then only we release.
1 more minute to go.
Yeah. So this is a post follow echo at 1 month. As you can see, the commissures are open widely. And significant improvement in the RV function. You could see that they have TAPSE improved from 12 to 23, and you can see the amount of RV dysfunction she has, and that improved significantly. So the technical and clinical factoids with regard to this Luton Bash shape, getting a good mitral opening and adjudication of the successful BME is often challenging, and it's very important in the substrate. Generally, the left heart symptoms are delayed in this group. And the INOE or the capsular balloon gets anchored in the septum routine BME. This I told probably doesn't happen in this particular group because of the large ASD. And once you get a good on-table result, our clinical follow-up has been extremely good in our cases where we have a successful result. So we had 12 patients. We were actually planned for transcatheter closure, and finally we did 7 out of this group, and then whoever patient we had done successful closure had good outcome. One patient had severe mitral regurgitation post BMB, and then she went for elective mitral replacement. Clinical follow-up, as I told you, successful procedures do have very good follow-up. So this is another case. I just go through this large ASD. This is not a straightforward large infraposterior deficiency. This is serial echo images we successfully managed with a 42 mm device. This ASD was measuring about 38. Interestingly, she had some MR. So this was a little bit difficult for us to assess. Again, as I told, we were meticulously monitoring the pressures, and subsequently we closed with a larger ASD occluded. So this is the echocardiogram images for that patient. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajit, for those very interesting cases. And now we move on to the last speaker, Dr. Sudeep, who will be speaking to us on dealing with malposition and embolization of devices. So over to you, Sudeep. Sudeep?
Just a minute. Sorry, sir. Are you able to hear me, sir?
Yeah, very well. And we can see your slides as well.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Edwin and all my teachers. And good evening to all my friends. This is a tale of cliffhanger ASD device where we made a lot of mistakes, but we learned how to avoid that. And we are able to do successfully all those things. So 9-year-old asymptomatic, otherwise diagnosed to ASD during routine evaluation for RTI with weight of 23 kg and with the clinical findings suggestive of ASD. So this is the typical echo baseline. You can see there is a thin floppy posterior inferior rim, but in the small aortic rim, so it actually measures around 20 mm. And this is the all other dimension, where the other dimension in the short axis is measuring around 15 mm, and in the subcostal is measuring maximum 21 mm. So we decided, and this is the in general how it looks like, because the aortic rim is deficient, to store more towards that. And then it's a cartoon that shows it's more towards the aortic and the floppy IVC rim. So we intended to, because including floppy rim is coming 21, 22, so we thought including everything, we did the 26 device. The intended device size for the closure for the ASD was 26 mm. So this is in general the routine left upper pulmonary vein placement, but it got Cobra. But as we anchor into that and with it dottering, we're able to overcome that Cobra, and then we're able to deploy it well. So 11 mm performance sheet was there. We routinely intubated the child also. So this is the device position. So actually we not taken care at that point, but this device position in the frontal view is not good. But we thought after checking everything in the echo, we thought it looks okay. So we deployed the device. But after that, you can see still it's hanging over there. But when we saw, in general, if you see the X-ray and the fluoro, the IS lies between T7 to T9, and this is the usual between T7 to T9. This should be the proper position. But here it's the more horizontal. Then when we saw the subcostal, we thought it looks okay. But when we realized the fourth chamber, it slipped out. You can see easily this is it's hanging. So luckily it was just hanging, but we not realized it before. So it's like a cliffhanger device hanging from the upper, but it missed the AV rim or the mitral side. So it causing the mitral wall obstruction. So at that point, we thought we need help emergency. So we keep the pediatric surgeon ready, but they told all 3 or 4 OTs were busy. Our pediatric surgeon was busy. So we called adult surgeon. He told he will try to arrange the OT, but by the time he pushed, you can try to retrieve the device. So it's like this, we have to take all our resources to do that. So finally, we thought we'll try to retrieve with the same 11 French sheet. It's a 24 mm device, Amplatzer device. So we did, and we're able to snare. But the problem was after that, because we are in that much stress, we are unable to actually store that image how we snared and we take into the sheath. But when we snared, but we are realized we are unable to get fully into the sheath. And what happened actually is that because it's a sheath which got crumpled, the device was half into outside the sheath and it was not coming inside into the sheath. So now because of the telescoping and the crumpling of the sheath, that device was not coming inside the sheath. So actually this is the condition. So we thought we'll pull as much as into that, but after that, when we pushed, we lost the device and it got embolized and it got stuck into the IVC and it was not coming back. So this is the situation. Sheath came out and we lost the puncture site also. Device hanged into iliac femoral vein. So now we thought we'll just have to keep the puncture ready if we want to retrieve that. So puncture taken again. This is you can see the puncture again taken, and this is the sheath, and we did the angiogram to see how it's occupying the iliac femoral vein. At that junction, we again called our vascular surgeon. If we suppose we are unable to retrieve, so surgeon can close the ASD and then the vascular surgeon can do the repair. But he told it will be very difficult in a 9-year-old, 23. He was not sure. So he was actually advising us just to keep it like that because the collaterals were forming and it was flowing very well. So, but we were not comfortable. As we all know, we can't keep that much big device into that. So that's what our adult cardiologist, my senior colleague, that told, no, Sudeep, you did so much. We are there. You just try to retrieve that. So we thought again we'll exchange it with the 11 sheath here. And you can see we just try to telescope into the sheath after with the device. Here we just into that. And after that, it was once with that, we thought we were able to re-screw it. So this is the 11 sheath. And you can see this is again, we re-screwed the device. And then finally, we are able to take it back into that. So luckily, we are able to save ourselves and the kid also. And then you see this is the final injection that shows the patent when although there is a small thrombosis there, but we continued heparin. So after that, we reassessed why we failed. So what we thought it's a 20 mm device, you see this picture, the rim which was is totally torn now. And the device is coming at least 26 to 27 mm here, defect. So we thought we'll undersize also and we not able to keep a good eye on the echo. That was our mistake. So we measured it's a 26. So finally we thought we'll do with the 30 device. So we successfully able to do the 30 device, and you see now in the frontal how the device should be look like overlapping on the board disc. So then we are able to salvage the baby, and this is the final images that shows the good picture, and there's a good flow across the mitral valve without any problem. So the issues, what we learned and we made mistakes, we take without surgeon backup. That was our first mistake. Probably undersize or thin rings give away or torn during first attempt. It may be the case, or we may undersize or our assessment was wrong. Or third thing, we are overconfident because we not checked very meticulously and very proper assessment. Like Dr. Krishnamurthy sir told, it's the main is the TE assessment that we made a mistake. We failed to take the clue from the fluoroscopy in spite of knowing the position of the ASD. Fifth, we take unbraided sheet. Sometimes it's our experience when you are taking an unbraided sheet, it will get crumpled, telescope, so it's unable to give the force to capture or to again redeploy and retrieve the device. Lost access, was luckily able to access it. And to be very frank, I was totally burned out. I thought I can't do, but our adult team working, they don't know, Sudeep, you are routinely doing. So once you lost in confidence, while others have confidence in you, you should have confidence in you. So with that in confidence, we are able to do it. But we made a lot of mistakes, but we realized we should not skip any of the proper assessment. So if we believe we can do it, we should be keep and calm and ask for the help. And asking for help is not a sign of strength. The sign of strength is not weakness. So I thank my senior RK Jain who told, no, Sudeep, you go ahead, don't send for surgery, it won't do well. I am 100% confident we are able to do that. So with that confidence from our colleagues, we're able to do it. So I'll thank everyone who got involved. So I am just ready for the comments and all what I can did and how we went wrong, and I'm ready to take all the experience from you people also. Thanks a lot for the kind listening.
Thanks, Sudeep, for that presentation. Really a nightmare. So, Edwin, over to you for the questions.
Yeah, the first question came from Dr. Risona has come. There's an absent REMS. The concern is when there is an absent coronary sinus REM, what is the strategy like? Is it likely to cause the coronary sinus obstruction? Is a possibility or not? Actually, I've never seen it. I would like the panelist or probably anybody can take the question if.
Over to you, Saurabh.
Yes, sir. As far as I understand, I have yet to see any case where there is truly deficient coronary sinus REM. I haven't come across this situation. So because if that rim is deficient, most likely the adjacent inferior rim is also deficient, and these cases possibly are not suitable for device. So we don't come across a situation. Others can add to it. Possibly my experience will be much lesser.
I quite endorse your views on this. And as a matter of fact, we have really not been so particular in looking at the coronary sinus rim. I'm not sure whether we are doing the right thing, but most often, if coronary sinus rim is absent, almost always you will find that the IVC rim will be significantly deficient or absent, and most of these patients will go for surgery.
We have been trying devices with many deficient REMs. We never come across a situation in which the coronary sinus got obstructed and then caused cardiac edema. Anything, I'm not so sure. Anybody of the fact, Dr. Krishnamurthy, Dr. Shiva, anybody has come across such?
No.
The reason for that is that the plane of coronary sinus ostium is quite different than the plane of the device. Dr. Shiva, sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
Less likely to. Dr. Shiva Kumar, is he around? You have anything? Never come across that. I thought it was anatomical reasons why it's not causing an obstruction because we are doing so many ASDs.
I agree with Saurav that the coronary sinus will not be in the regular plane of the atrial septum at all. And often the type of coronary sinus ostium, we see the coronary sinus course. Hence, the relationship between defect and the coronary sinus ostium is going to be very tough to be understood. Except in cases of the true coronary sinus ASDs, where the entire thing is different. It's a dilated coronary sinus ostia. And then in the course of the coronary sinus, there is an unroofing, where people have reported closing that unroofed roof of the coronary sinus, leaving behind the actual cavity of the coronary sinus to be in relation to the right atrial part of the device. There is no coronary sinus compromise by an ASD device. I also feel.
Another question to Dr. Neeraj is like, probably, how do you specific way to interdigitate the rims of two devices? If you have multiple devices you are attempting. And which device to be released first, which device to be deployed first is always a concern.
Neeraj, you have to unmute. You have to unmute. You are muted.
Yeah. Whenever the planning is the most important part of any procedure, and this is particularly true when doing a multiple ASD device closures. Planning involves one, looking at the ASDs. If there are multiple ASDs, they are in which plane? Are they in the same plane or they are in different plane? Is septum is aneurysmal? What is the rim? What is the rim? Are the rim very close? Do I need to support one ASD? Suppose I have to seat one ASD and the ASD is getting a 7 millimeter rim which is jutting onto outside and I have to deploy the other device. Am I going to take the support of this particular 7 millimeter rim, or it is going to lie away from my plane? If it is aneurysmal, or if there are multiple defects, which ASD I have to target? If it is a central defect, it can cover the smaller adjacent defect. So this is important. The planning is the most important point. I think that was the question. I didn't get it, Dr. Edwin.
Yeah,
I have two questions for you, Neeraj. One is 3D TE essential for doing the so-called fenestrated or multi-fenestrated ASD?
Sir, in fact, I should be asking question to you with your experience. But yes, personally, I feel 3D is a very important guide. But if you ask me, I trust my 2D diameters more. I'm more comfortable with it. 3D gives you a good picturization, but I'm still comfortable with 2D dimensional and making 3D imaging by itself. So maybe your experience, or Dr. Shiva's experience, if 3D is a better guide.
I will ask Shiva to comment on that, but I have one question for you. You say that enter through the central hole. How simple or difficult it is to enter through the central hole when you have a multi-fenestrated ASD?
Yes, sir. That is the crux of if there's like the cribiform which we have shown one. So the important is that once be it cribiform or not cribiform, my 7 millimeter should cover the other defects. So TE, I believe, is a very important essential aspect, and one should spend time on assessing which particular hole one has crossed through, whether it is the target hole which we are targeting, and whether if I deploy a device there, it's going to cover my other defects.
And for that reason, I think 3D will be certainly superior to 2D, no matter how good the pictures are on 2D. Over to you, Shiva, for your comments.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dr. Bharat. Definitely 3D is going to give a much better perspective. The problem with a multi-fenestrated ASD is, if suppose there are 2 or 3 defects with a thick intervening good quality septum, you get a good quality 3D transesophageal view. But often they are associated with a thin floppy aneurysm where the aneurysmal septum keeps having excessive mobility. And through that excessively mobile, thin, floppy septum, you identify multiple fenestrations. In those cases, 3D transesophageal echo gives a very poor delineation. So it's primarily when we are doing the 2D echo, we will probably get an idea whether the 3D is going to be useful or not. But 3D is far more superior in telling us whether the defects are related supra-inferiorly, antero-posteriorly. So it gives a great amount of insight.
So if you have it and if you have the expertise, I think you should be using it. But if you don't have it, doesn't mean that you cannot close multi-fenestrated ASDs. Definitely 3D is more handy. And sometimes in children, for technical reasons, you cannot use 3D because of the size of the patient. So that's a different issue altogether.
One point, I tend to use pretty often balloon sizing in those multiple ASDs to see how does it look when you have the major defects balloon occluded, how much the flows it, other defects tend to flow, how significantly, and slightly oversizing the primary defects in smaller pediatric patients. I tend to avoid using multiple devices. Probably if somebody wants to have an opinion on that, on balloon sizing when there are multiple defects. panelists have not got involved here.
Yeah, today I use balloon sizing only in multiple defects. So the advantage number one is that as you rightly pointed out, we can identify what is the size of the defect and whether it is able to squeeze out and reduce the flow in the other defect. And second is, after putting the balloon, then you take the next catheter and try to cross. And the crossing catheter will always go through the second hole and not through the hole that you have occluded. So this is a second way of confirmed entry through two different holes rather than two catheters through the same hole. And the third advantage is that there are patients who have more than two. You may think that there are only two in the original echocardiography, and then when you put in the two balloons and inflate both the balloons, then you will realize that there is more than it's the sensitivity of echocardiography reduces the moment the more and more the number of defects are. 2 is easy, 3 is difficult, 4 is even more difficult. So when you have two balloons occluding the two major ASDs, it is easy to pick up the further additional ones.
Dr.
Our policy.
Can I make a point?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Instead of balloon sizing of the multiple ASD, we can take a device itself and occlude it. Many of the multiple ASD can be close to a single device. So additional manipulation, additional balloon, additional hardware may not be required many times. If the device, after putting the device, still there is residual flow, then you reassess. That is one.
Our policy is a little different. Our policy is we call it balloon interrogation. It's not balloon sizing. In order to know the redundancy of the intervening tissue, we will go through the one hole and not only stop at stop flow, we will keep on inflating the balloon. That will give us an understanding about how redundant the intervening septum is. And many times you may have to go through both the holes. In one direction, the redundancy may not be adequate, but when you go through the other hole and push the tissue on the other side, the redundancy is complete. And there are so many patients where we have been able to convert two device strategy into a single device strategy by using this balloon interrogation technique. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have the time, but I will show you how this can be done, and this can come very handy in deciding the strategy of 1 versus 2 devices. We are not the believers of 7 and 8 millimeter distances between the two defects. You can have 9 millimeter distance and you can stretch it to one defect, and you can have 5 millimeter distance and it will be so rigid, the tissue, that you will not be able to use a single device.
Yeah, I completely agree with that point, because like many pediatric age group, most of the time we get away without having multiple devices.
Absolutely.
Because septum we end up using.
Can I make another point?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Can I make one more point?
Please.
Many of these multiple ASD are not multiple. They will be connected at one end, maybe a U shape or a horseshoe shape or a V shape. So in those cases, we can get away with a single device. This can be better seen on a 3D rather than a 2D.
Sure. I agree with you on that.
There's a question by Dr. Shakti to Dr. Ajit Pillai. Is there any surgical versus percutaneous series on data in Luttenbach or something? And I'm not aware. Either.
The single center experience published, but I don't think there is any kind of a major series.
Ajit, we can't hear you.
To my knowledge, not big large series available. Largely a single center experiences, a series of 3 or 4 cases. I'm also trying to publish my data because I
can't hear you. You will have to come close to the mic. We can't hear you.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah, you are audible now.
Yeah, no, I was telling that to my knowledge, there is no large series comparison between percutaneous versus surgical, but surgical remains a gold standard. But some of these patients, like young females who like to conceive and start family, and then there are so many other reasons. And then some of these patients are extremely sick for the surgeon to operate. Barring that, I think the anatomical concerns I already told. To my knowledge, I have not come across a very large comparative series between surgical and percutaneous as well. We are trying to publish our data, but I'm just waiting for our follow-up series, because something which is follow-up is more important in this group of patients. How many really required mitral replacement in the long run?
I want to ask you one question. You will agree with me that mitral stenosis is a recurrent disease.
Yes, yes.
When you put a device as big as 36 and 40 millimeters in the interatrial septum, what would happen if this patient were to get a recurrence of mitral stenosis? How simple or difficult would it be to approach the mitral valve if you were to end up with a replacement? Because this patient has undergone already 2 valvotomies. This is the third. And if you come back, I think the chances of this valve salvaging this valve is difficult. So what do your surgeons have to say?
What we are seeing is actually there is a shift in the type of patients we see. We don't see those kind of virgin valves which we used to see 10 or 15 years back, or maybe even 20 years back. Now, more and more cases are coming with kind of advanced valve disease. So these are patients who are probably destined for a surgical replacement somewhere down the line. And percutaneous mode of treatment is basically to tide off the acute crisis, or maybe for the give a good gap of 5-6 years by the time they can complete family and then think about a mitral mitral 40 years. So in many cases, when we think that the mitral disease we are going to balloon, we are very, very humble in my approach. As I told you, our follow-up has to be very, very clear and stringent in this group of patients. Yeah.
But is it not a nightmare for your surgeons to get out that 40 millimeter device to approach the mitral valve?
So far, yeah, that is one concern. So that is one concern. I agree with you, especially with the lateral approach. That can be a concern. Yes, but we are, as I told you, this is a small experience, and then of course these are patients which, when in that immediate setup, there is not much of a better option. So I fully agree with your concerns.
Dr. Dalvi, I would like to put a question to the
Can I
panel.
make a point?
Yeah. Just want to have our panelists' views on Dr. Krishnamurthy's decision on not using a fluoroscopy. I just want the general opinion. Do you advise that, or do you want to try it out in your place? What do you think about this?
My personal feeling is that this technique requires a lot of experience, and I think looking at it definitely has a learning curve. As a matter of fact, that is my question to Dr. Krishnamurthy. How long or how big was his learning curve on this? Means in how many patients they crossed over onto fluoro before they became expert. So unless you are in such a large volume center that you are doing, say, 100, 150 ASDs per year, I think to acquire some kind of expertise in this technique would be difficult. This is my opinion. I don't have experience on that, but Krishnamurthy has. So he will have to tell us what was his learning curve, how many times they were unsuccessful in getting into pulmonary vein, how many times they perforated the left atrial appendage, whatever. I mean, he will have to tell us.
Yes, sir. Let me answer that. We now have close to 1,200 patients data. We have nearly 75% of them zero fluoroscopy, and about 20% of the patients having less than 1 minute fluoroscopy. That is, 1 minute fluoroscopy is for just have a look at the device for some reason, or unscrewing there is some problem, you go for a device, or you just enter the REPV, something like that. That is nearly 10, 15 to 20%. We have had no complications, zero complications. In fact, complications are there for patients who have had fluoroscopy, not for the echo bed. And regarding the learning curve, initially our time was more. The time taken for the procedure was more. We do need another operator. It cannot be done with a single operator. And when we compare our initial 50% of the cohort, the second 50% of the cohort, the time required is much significantly less. So there is definitely a learning curve, and we do not advise beginners to start this. In fact, our residents, our fellows are more comfortable with the echo guided when they go out rather than fluoro guided.
So Krishnamurthy, after doing how many cases on fluoroscopy, did you venture into doing it without fluoroscopy? You must have done 1,000 cases before going into non-fluoroscopic approach.
Yes, initially more than 1,500 we have done with fluoroscopy only, but then gradually shifted. It was a gradual evolution into a totally non-fluoroscopy.
No, I understand. I completely understand. I take your point, but this is an important message that somebody who is doing 20 cases cannot really venture into this kind of a technique unless he has a sizable experience and expertise in doing this.
And then having the fluoroscope ready. You are using a cath lab anyway. So there is
Yeah.
in ASD, our usual fluoro time is only 2 minutes at the most. The routine, if you are suspecting a difficult case, you are likely then you're anyway going over to the fluoro. So a routine case, if you are doing with fluoro, our usual fluoro time should not take 2 to 3 minutes. And then you are avoiding a esophageal echo, you're avoiding a GA. So procedure time, not to the procedure as such, but going for general anesthesia, that will take longer procedure time if you include that also. If you're not including that your 10 minutes is
generally our patients are younger, so most of them are having GA. Adults are certainly less, so they're all having TE. And even adults, when we explain to these patients this non-fluoroscopic technique, almost all of them, except one 67-year-old lady, they refused. So they prefer this.
My question to you is that are there any patients whom you will not advise only transesophageal echo controlled device closure? Or,
as I told,
no
yes,
matter whatever the size, whatever the rims, whatever
yes,
the lie of the means,
yes,
you will be doing it in patients with dextrocardia, mesocardia, corrected transposition, everything.
there's such type of complicated like dextrocardia and all. We can do this, although we have not done, but we assume that it is possible. But those with corrected transposition, we have not attempted. And deficient rims also, T is better than fluoroscopy. Fluoroscopy anyway, you cannot see the rims. So T is certainly the better one. Even multiple ASD we are closed without fluoroscopy.
just
One more point I'll make about the multiple ASD. This discussion is over.
Yeah, go ahead, please, quick.
When there is a multifenestrated ASD, it is better or preferable not to do more of maneuvers, more of manipulations, more balloon sizing, because of possible tearing and embolization is there. So in the first attempt itself, put the largest calculated device and come out. That is the.
Fine. There's another question about use of fenestrated device in Luttenbecker syndrome. Is it now? I don't know whether it's freely available, but is another option available if you are trying to do a device closure in those who are having a mitral stenosis? Is that any opinion? Dr. Shiva Prasad asked this question. Ajit Pillai. Oh, sorry, Dr. Ajit Pillai has gone out for an emergency reason. So go to the embolization. Dr. Shakti will ask, does the snare-assisted deployment really gives protection against embolization or dislodgement? I never done that, so I don't.
Right, sir, but actually we were not expected. As we initially shows in the echo image, it looks like it's pretty straightforward. The mistake we made actually, probably
not your particular case. You're just asking the snare-assisted deployment gives like overall. Like, do you have any?
Yes, sir. It definitely gives an edge because when the deficient rim, 2 or 3 deficient rims, and one rim is floppy, one is not there. Personally, we did for few cases and we found out in one case where it slipped and we are able to capture on snare assisted. So definitely that is one of the, but it requires little more skill as compared because you have to keep the snare, you have to keep it that tight. And then if it embolize, you are able to take it. So definitely snare assisted in when the deficient rim you are doing the large defect. Definitely, I think Shiva sir already published also and told also how it helped in the other cases where it got the high chances of embolization. But personally, we also tried in some cases, we found out it's quite helpful when it's a multiple deficient rims.
Which size snare do you use?
So we use actually there are two, we use 15 or 20 snares actually. Not using the 10 snare, but usually most of the time we are using 15 or 20 snares. We use either 15 or 20 snare, EV3 snares.
Can I make a couple of points, sir?
Yes,
Go ahead.
Sure.
First point is about the snare assisted ASD is definitely helpful. Shiva sir has demonstrated it time and again, and we often use it whenever there is a large device with deficient floppy rims. Snare assisted will tell you what is the deployment position, final deployment position, when compared to when the device is being held by cable only, because there is always a recoil of the device that happens when you're actually holding the device with the cable alone. This problem is partially overcome by the recently launched this Travasio system where the terminal portion of the cable is a little flexible. So that is quite useful, and other companies also have to follow this invention, I suppose. And just to acknowledge the fact about ASD and the TE-assisted ASD device closure, just today we did one complex ASD closure in a patient with dextrocardia. Here I could not actually deploy or cross the ASD also with fluoroscopy alone. So we had to extensively use TE to cross the ASD, deploy the device and everything. So it was really an exciting procedure. We took a lot of time, but mostly used only TE. Thank you, sir.
One question from Dr. Mahendra Perikar from Maharashtra. He wants to know what grade of MR you want to back off or to decide against a device in an ASD. That's always a question. Sometimes it's confusing. If what level of MR is more than mild, less than mild, mild to moderate, what's the mechanism MR, it will be MVP MR most likely. So at what is the grade in which you decide on continuing with the device closure versus? Anybody want to?
I would think first what is the etiology of that MR, whether it is a rheumatic MR or whether it's a prolapse. But anything certainly more than mild, I would probably be less enthusiastic about closing the ASD, because the concern is, and especially when you have large defects, that approach to mitral valve after 6 months or 9 months can be quite difficult to handle. I know of surgeons struggling getting that device out because most of the approaches are from the right atrial roof. So I would be really concerned about progression of MR and dealing with this mitral valve.
One more point to add to Dr. Galvis. When the defect is closed with this significant MR, the left atrial enlargement, chances of left atrial enlargement is more and arrhythmia is more if a significant MR is left behind because the pop-up mechanism is lost. So a significant MR if present, ASD should not be closed by percutaneously.
Can I ask a question, please?
Go ahead.
So in Nepal, most of our patients, almost in our study, we have found out that around 70% of the cases, they don't have aortic rim. So if apart from aortic rim is absent, and if the posterior rim is also absent, do you suggest us to go for a ASD device closure or simply refer those cases for surgical closure?
Our approach is that whether aortic rim is absent or present, if the posterior rim is absent, the absent is true absence of the posterior rim. Yeah. Inability to see because you haven't visualized it properly is different. But if you don't have a rim, we would be really, our threshold for going with device closure is very, very high. I mean, we would never do it. We would leave it for the surgeons to take care.
Sir, can I come in here?
Approach, sorry, go ahead, Saurabh.
Sir, yep. So the absent rim is really a crucial thing to be differentiated in the posterior inferior region especially. There is a paper which has said that if you look at the rims to define your defect, then sometimes many so-called ostium second rim defect will fall in the range of a sinus venosus defect. And we all have had experiences when we have embolized the device and the surgeons have told that the rims were actually bald. There was nothing. So we have to be very careful in such a subset of patients.
And another thing I would like to say is that, sometimes you see a small tissue dangling, thoda sa hai. When in doubt, don't do it. Even if you have 1% doubt, this rim is not good enough, just back out. Rather than having it embolized, and not that anything, nothing big, but, rather than embolizing a device and calling the surgeon, I think it's better to just back out and tell the surgeon to take over. Failure, at least in my opinion, is not an issue, but complication is definitely an issue.
Sir, sometimes, sir, Amitav here, sir.
Amitav,
go ahead.
Yeah, sir. Sometimes when we see, as Saurabh depicted, especially the two most dangerous rims are the absence of retroatrial rim and the posterior inferior rim. Sometimes we tend to put that a bit of a larger device which might make up for the smaller rims. So though we go by the dictum of 1.5 times the body weight or the total septal length and all, according to your experience, which one works best? Kind of size of the defect, size of the device compared to the size of the patient, or the body, the height ratio or the defect height ratio.
I think
how big a device can we really put? which is safe?
I think that if you have my definition is that if you have a defect, no matter how large, but if the surrounding rims are adequate, that septal length and that heart is large enough to take that large device. So if you tell me that I have a 6 kg child who has a 18 millimeter device, 18 millimeter hole with 5 millimeter rims all around, I'm willing to put a 19 millimeter or a 18 millimeter device in this child, although it is 300%.
Right.
This issue has been discussed widely, and we have presented our experience of 45 cases of patients less than 10 kgs in the January issue of Annals of Pediatric Cardiology 2021. And we have discussed these issues of what is the importance of septal length, how large is too large in children. All those issues are discussed with the help of our own data.
Right.
Good.
Edwin, should we move on to the next topic? I know that there will be innumerable questions, but then we will have to stay here for a pretty long time.
Sure, we can proceed with the call.
Okay, so with your permission, I think we will move on to the next topic of coarctation of aorta, wherein we have 3 speakers. And I will start with Dr. Srinivas, who is going to present a case in box. Over to you, Srinivas.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yeah, and you are audible as well.
Thanks. So I'm going to present a case of coarctation stenting. This is a pretty straightforward case. This was a 29-year-old male who weighed about 54 kilos. He was detected to have upper limb hypertension 6 months ago. He was on antihypertensives with poorly controlled blood pressure. Echocardiogram showed a severe coarctation of aorta, which was very close to the left subclavian artery origin with concentric LVH. So as with most of the cases of coarctation of aorta, we do imaging before deciding on the treatment modality. This was a CT scan of the same patient. This was in the coronal plane. You can see there is a very tight coarctation. In sagittal plane, the coarctation is very close to the left subclavian artery origin, even though it's not as bad as it looks. So this was axial planes. This is a coarctation point. So this patient has severe coarctation of aorta. This image just shows the degree of collaterals what the patient can have. Okay, so there are collaterals from literally every artery possible between the upper and lower thoracic aorta. Okay, so this is a multiplanar imaging just to localize and identify the different coarctation segments. So in the next slide, we would actually show the 3D reconstruction. So this is a volume rendering image of coarctation of aorta. So as you can see, this is a 360 degrees view. This would help us to get the actual 3D orientation of the coarctation before we decide on the stent. As it was evident from the other images also, so this coarctation has the subclavian artery is quite close to the origin of the coarctation. Okay, so these were the measurements. So this is the length of the coarc segment or the desirable length of the stent that we will be placing, approximately 3.5 centimeters. So this is a transverse arch diameter and this is the descent thoracic aortic diameter. We normally base our coarctation stent size, that is the balloon size, based on the transverse arch diameter or the largest diameter beyond the isthmus. Okay, whether you want to use a covered stent or a uncovered stent. This patient, if we use a covered stent, obviously we would be completely occluding the left subclavian artery. So this was anyway discussed with our surgeon, the referring cardiologist, and also the patient about this possibility of completely occluding the left subclavian artery. It was decided that it is better to keep this left subclavian artery patient, so we chose to use an uncovered stent in this patient. Okay, so what is the procedure strategy for us? We definitely go by femoral arterial access with plan for a percutaneous closure. Femoral arterial size required in this patient would be 11 French. Left radial access was also taken for 2 purposes. One is to help in crossing, do a check angiogram at the time of deployment, and also for balloon dilatation of the left subclavian origin. So we chose an uncovered 39 millimeter Andra XL stent mounted on an Atlas Gold 16 into 40 millimeter balloon. So this is the access. We usually use both fluoroscopy and also the ultrasonography guidance for all this access, just because we need to be accurate about the puncture site. We want to be above the common femoral bifurcation, a little bit above that. Mostly, if you are against the body of the femoral head, you are safe actually. You will not actually encounter any small structures, and perclose device also works well in this case. If you take a puncture very low one, you would be completely damaging the profunda femoris artery. And also, when you use a perclose device, this entire lumen might get occluded. So the puncture site is extremely important for when you are planning to put a large arterial sheaths. So this is the image of a perclose device. I'm not going to show the entire procedure today for the lack of time. So this is how we cross the defect. You can see that there's a catheter which is being inserted from the left subclavian artery. So we are crossing from below using a 4 French GR catheter and a straight hemorrhoid. So crossing was not very easy, but this is a final crossing image that I'm showing you. Okay, so this is a digital subtraction angiography of the same. As you can see, as we anticipated, so the left subclavian artery origin is quite close to the coarctation segment. So this much length of proximal arch is available for stenting state. Sorry, distal arch is available for stenting. Just as a prophylactic measure, we dilated the origin of the left subclavian artery for whatever worth it was. That was a 12 into 4 millimeters balloon. We could not actually pass the sheath at the first attempt. Otherwise, we do not do the predilatation routinely in all the cases. So here we have predilated this defect with a 12 into 4 balloon, which was used for the left subclavian origin as well. So now we have passed the 11 French delivery sheath. So this is a Cook's delivery sheath, Mullin's delivery sheath. So this is taken over a 035 Teflon guide rail. So once we do that, here we are actually trying to place the stent in appropriate position. We are doing constant check angiograms with the 4 French GR catheter inserted through the left radial artery. So once we have the proper position here, now we would do one final check angio. Okay. So here through the sheath now. Okay, we are happy about the position of the stent. So this is a deployment of the stent. So again, this is a Atlas gold balloon, which is 16 into 40 millimeters, and this is a 39 millimeter long Andrus stent. Okay, so this is the final fluoroscopic picture. You can see that the left side of subclavian artery is nicely patent, and the stent is in the desirable position. So this patient was discharged the next day after this. Of course, we closed the arteriotomy with ProGlide catheter. So just briefly, I'm going to present what are the essentials of coarctation stenting. Case selection is very, very important. Of course, both echo and additional imaging will be required in most of the cases. Choose a stent according to the need. So vascular access has to be well planned along with the plan to closure of the vascular access. And also we'll have to have strategy for stenting depending upon the situation. Ideally, more than 7 years is desirable. Balloon size should not be greater than the transverse arch. Favorable anatomy should be there for the stenting. CT angiogram is very, very helpful if you don't have good echo images, especially in an adult patient. Stent selection, you have a choice between covered and uncovered stent, but if given a choice, covered stent is always preferable because it's associated with lesser number of complications. Uncovered stent has an advantage of cost and also the advantage of not occluding the side branches. You have an option between self-expanding and also balloon expandable, but for a case of coarctation, we would always prefer a balloon expandable stent. These are the commercial stents available in India right now. So Zypher is just being introduced. So you can use any of these stents for your procedure. So what about the access and the closure? Larger stents would require a very large sheath. Minimum will be 10 French sheath. So always puncture above the profunda femoris bifurcation. Use ultrasound and fluoroscopy guidance, and always plan your closure beforehand. So in earlier days, we used to always do a surgical cut down before inserting a large sheath. So you can still do this, or you can actually get used to using one of these closure devices. These are the two common closure devices that is available in India. So here, if you have to put a sheath of 6 or even 8, you can use an angio-seal device. 8 and above, you can actually use a Perclose ProGlide device. If it is more than 11 or 12, you can use 2 Perclose ProGlide suture devices. So to close the femoral artery function. So I was talking about stent strategy. This is a very, very wide topic. This basically depends upon how bad or how complex the coarctation is. Discrete coarctations are the most easiest to stent. Tubular coarctations, yes, you have to prefer to use a covered stent more often because chances of dissection is higher if the segment of coarctation is longer. Interruption requires special precautions. I think Srinath is going to present one case after this. If it involves major branches, again, we'll have to have strategies for preserving the flow through that side branches. Many times you will have to have an hybrid approach. Surgeon has to reimplant the left subclavian artery onto the carotid artery before you do a covered stent. So if there is a transverse hypoplastic arch, then the treatment has to be highly individual. Many of the times you may not be able to use a stent in these patients. Presence of aneurysms, you should try to cover all the aneurysms which you see along the course of the coarctation. So otherwise, there is always a chances of clot formation and rupture. So if you're stenting for a small child, you should also have an idea to future dilate these stents. So you'll have to use a stent which can be dilated again when the child grows up. Complex arch anatomy is a completely different ballgame. It needs advanced planning as well. Presence of PDA, again, covered stent is very, very desirable, or you'll have to put a PDA device and uncovered stent, again, based on case-to-case situation. Just to summarize, coarctation stenting is a very gratifying procedure, only if it is carefully planned with proper imaging before the stenting is undertaken. Plan access as well in advance, because this is a major determining factor in a patient with coarctation. Anticipate complications and tackle all the complications even before they occur, because once they occur, it is quite difficult to handle the complications. Thank you for patient listening. I'll just wait for the questions at the end.
Yes. Dr. Srinath. You can stop.
Thanks, Srinivas, for this overview on coarct stenting. I think we'll move on to the next speaker, and Dr. Srinath will speak on acquired interruption. Over to you, Dr. Srinath.
Good evening, everyone. My case is a continuation of what Dr. Srinivas had told. It's a similar case, but it was acquired interruption, a coarctation which had got on long standing and it has got interrupted. This was a 19-year-old girl weighing about 48 kgs who was incidentally detected to have hypertension. Her upper limb blood pressures were 190 by 110, lower limb pulses were not palpable. Echo, when we tried to do the echo, there was the arch was not very clear, but only finding which was suggestive on the echo was that there was a continuous flow in the descending aortic Doppler. So had we not done the descending aortic Doppler, probably we could miss this case. So this girl was sent for a CT iotogram, and the CT iotogram, as we see in the lateral view, we can see a definite level of significant cutoff between about 3 millimeters interruption of the aorta is seen from the arch and the thoracic aorta, post subclavian area. So this is the 3D recon, and we could make out that there was about 3 millimeters tissue between the thoracic and the transverse arch, post subclavian coarctation. And as you know, all these coarctations develop significant collaterals. So what do we do? So one question is, surgery, or the other option as an interventionist, should we try crossing the lesion and try to stent the cord, or in this case, as we can call it as an acquired interruption. And the type of stent, whether it has to be a covered stent, an uncovered stent, that is, we have to decide based on the lesion. So what we did, the approach was, we took a right radial axis, put a pigtail catheter, did an angiogram. We confirmed that there was not much significant flow from the ascending aorta to the descending aorta. That was significant post-subclavian narrowing. Then we took a MPA catheter, tried to cross the lesion, and did a end-hold injection. And here also we can see that there is not much of dye going across the lesion. So what we thought is we would try to puncture it. We used a CTO wire, and we tried to cross the interrupted segment of about 3 to 4 millimeters. So once we were, now we have to be careful that we are in the true lumen. So what we did, we confirmed we did an angio. It looks like we almost in the same plane, and we repeated the angio in another plane. Here also it looks that we are within the lumen of the aorta. So from here we tried to snare the wire. but we couldn't snare the wire after 1 or 2 attempts. Then we realized that is there any mistake. So what we did is we took an RAO view. This is a view from the RAO. In the RAO view, we can clearly make out that the wire is not within the lumen, and only we had confirmed it only in 2 planes, and we were trying to snare it. So that's why we couldn't snare the wire. So keeping the same wire as a we used another wire as another buddy wire and recrossed the lesion and repunctured the site. Now we checked in all the views, AP, lateral, and in RAO view. And now in the RAO view, as you can see, the previous wire was outside the lumen, and this puncture looks well within the lumen. So we took a snare, we snared it with the help of an end snare. And once we made the railroad, we crossed, we took a pigtail and crossed the lesion and did an angiogram. The angiogram showed significant narrowing of that lesion. So we prepared the lesion with a 7 mm balloon dilatation first. Then again, we did with the 12 mm dilatation. We can see with the 12 mm, there was a significant waste. So again, did an angio to make sure that there was no dissection. Then actually, this was the case where, where we didn't go with the routine stents because of there was some financial constraints. For the first time, we tried Vascular Concepts ProStar XXL stent, which is a balloon mounted stent, 20 mm into 40 mm in length. So we had as you can see, as you show, when we tried to inflate, what happened? The balloon melanceed down, and the lesion was gradually, it slipped off. So as we are trying to deflate, we couldn't actually hold on to the lesion. So we did an angio. We took the balloons gradually across this thing, across the coax segment, and tried to again re-inflate it. But re-inflate and try to keep the stent in position. But as what happened was, when we tried to do that, the stent slipped off the coax lesion and it gradually moved. But what we were lucky that the balloon was within the stent, this thing. So we parked the embolized stent in the almost in the thoracic and descending aorta junction. So next, what we did, once we were sure that we were safe, then now we took a long sheath. Before we had not taken the long sheath because we had the check angios from the radial side. So, but because we had already ended up into a problem, so we took a 12 French long sheath across, checked everything, and there was no dissection. We luckily had the same company 22 millimeters stent with us, though we had a covered stent as a backup. So, but because there were some financial constraints, we thought, okay, with the help, let us try to do it more precisely. So again, when we start to do it, again, the expansion of the stent was not proper. So this time what we did is, because we have already got this thing, so we tried, when we were seeing that the stent balloon was melanceading, we pushed, we gave the support of the sheath and tried to push the balloon so that it doesn't melancead down, and we could somehow capture the coax or the interrupted segment. And we could catch the interrupted segment, and we retrieved the balloon, and this was the final angio, which showed that there was no dissection and well expanded coax or the interrupted segment. We checked the angio of the embolized or stent, and we were lucky enough that it was an open cell stent. So also, and we were just above the celiac plexus. So these were the 2 stents. We ended up putting 2 stents in this patient. End result was good. There was post-procedure no gradient. Follow-up also is good. Her upper limb blood pressure is decreased. This was a descending thoracic aortic Doppler after this thing. Few take-home points in our case was, sometimes when we are doing echo, when there is a very critical coarctation, arch view might be very misleading, because there might not be a sufficient gradient. So always do an abdominal aortic Doppler to look for any continuous flows. Then angios, when we are trying to puncture and we are not sure, we are puncturing the interrupted lesion, right? We have to do angios in multiple use to make sure that we are within the lumen. Always take 2 axis, upper limb axis, and practice a railroad technique, which will be safe. Stent embolization or dislodgement, we should not panic and try to park the stent as much as possible, if possible, within the thoracic aorta. And with careful planning, we can probably we can do this procedures with uncovered stent. Thank you.
Thanks, Srinath, for sharing that case with some complications which you were able to overcome so successfully. We move on to the last speaker of this evening, Dr. Anand, who is going to present his case of middle aortic syndrome. Over to you, Anand.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Edwin. Are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead. Quite audible and I can see you well.
So I'm just going to present 2 case scenarios. One was a 10-year-old girl who presented to us with severe biventricular dysfunction, and she had a discrepancy in the blood pressure. And on echo, we knew that she had luminal irregularities in the abdominal aorta and a loss of pulse in the left upper limb as well. And so clinically, this was a case of aortoarthritis that we were dealing with. And this shows the initial pigtail angiogram in this patient, and there's hardly a trickle of flow that you can see beyond the coarcted segment. So this was initially dilated with a 6x39 mm OmniLink balloon, and we usually use non-compliant balloons in cases of aortoarthritis. The associated this was inflated at 14 atmospheres, and then serially onto an 8x59 mm OmniLink balloon at 14 atmospheres. And this is the final result. This is just a hand contrast injection given through a multipurpose catheter. And you can see that we actually achieved a good result in this case. And there was almost immediate improvement in the ventricular function immediately after the procedure and definitely the next day. And this was a hemodynamic data with a gradient of around 46 between the 2 segments, which came down to 10 with the balloon dilatation. This was just to give an idea of the pre-procedure contrast CT, which we had done prior to actually planning this procedure. And if you can see here, this is actually just the aortic lumen that was left. And you can see the thick wall of the aorta in this patient. And now we've been following up this patient's for this patient for over a year now. And as part of protocol, we have now started doing MRIs for these patients as part of follow-up for aortoarthritis while continuing on immunosuppressive medications. And the T2 image actually sequence over here, which actually helps identify neural edema as opposed to fibrosis. And you can see that the lumen diameter, which was achieved here, is quite good. And the intensity is not very bright as it would be for fibrosis and also for a severe degree of inflammation in this patient. And these are the T1 images again in this patient at follow-up, and again shows a reasonably good sized lumen at the place where he had dilated and with not much of wall thickening or edema. This is just to give an idea of the pre-procedure contrast CT when she presented to us 1 year ago. And this was a follow-up MRI SAG image showing the lumen that we have achieved and which has stayed patent 1 year later after the procedure. This was another 16-year-old boy who presented to us with refractory hypertension and biventricular dysfunction. And this was again diagnosed clinically as aortoarthritis. And you can see here the initial, the lesion was crossed as described earlier with a Terumo and a multipurpose catheter. And this is just a contrast injection given through the multipurpose catheter. And we started inflating this with, again, a non-compliant 8x40 mm indigo balloon. And these were subsequent inflations done across various portions using graded. It was the 6 first, and then the 7, and then the 8. And this was the final inflation which we did with using a 14x40 Boa balloon, and the gradients which were initially 52 reduced to 10 at the end of the procedure. So this is just to give an idea of the pre-procedural angiogram and the post-procedural angiogram. And as you can see here, these are quite fibrotic and tough lesions. And when you use non-compliant balloons to inflate them, small amounts of dissection are not very uncommon. You can see a flap over here which has been raised, but as long as it's non-flow limiting, you would rather just leave them alone instead of going ahead and putting a stent. Now, this boy was on immunosuppressive medications, a combination of methotrexate and MMF and steroids for some time as advised by the rheumatologist. And he came back to us 3 months ago, again with uncontrolled hypertension. And as you can see here, the region above the splenic artery, he has again developed multiple irregularities with 2 definite points of stenosis, one just above the splenic artery. So we decided to go ahead and balloon dilate him again. And this was the end result of the balloon dilatation. So these were the balloons which we had used in this patient. Again, started off with a small size balloon of around 18x40 EV3. And then we went on to dilate it with a 15x50 Z-mid balloon. So I think this is something which is quite debatable, but there is a clearer idea emerging right now with regards to treatment options in aortoarthritis. Immunosuppressives and involving a rheumatologist in management plan is very crucial. And so is a follow-up imaging on MR, so the radiology team does get involved. Now, whether it's balloon dilatation or stenting versus surgery, I think surgery is usually left as a last resort because of anastomotic site, aneurysms, and stenosis which can develop. With regards to balloon dilatation and stenting, there is more data available now to say that balloon dilatation is probably better than stenting these patients because the disease is an ongoing process. However, immunosuppressive regime might be, and we really don't know. And putting a stent is only probably going to compromise the lumen of the aorta further. And this was one, probably this is the only meta-analysis that has come out on endovascular balloon angioplasty versus stenting in patients with Takayasu's arthritis, which included a total of 266 patients and 316 lesions. And balloon angioplasty was performed in 186 lesions and stenting in 130. And the conclusion was that there were no significant differences in the incidence of either restenosis or other complications between balloon angioplasty and stenting. And in fact, in the renal arteries, the risk of restenosis and stenting was significantly higher than with balloon angioplasty alone. Drug-eluting balloons have been used by some centers, again, not large numbers in terms of data. Then certain questions which we always have: should we intervene when there is an active inflammation? I don't know what the other panelists over here feel, but usually when patients come to us, they usually come to us very sick, as you can see with those presentations of severe biventricular dysfunction. So I really don't know how practical it is to actually see that kind of a lesion and send them home and ask them to come back after 6 weeks of immunosuppressive therapy. So most of the times we end up starting steroids and do have to intervene. And in which case, again, balloon dilatation is probably relatively safer rather than putting in a stent when there is active inflammation. With regards to renal artery intervention, which is again a common subset which we face in patients with Takayasu's arthritis, I think as with atherosclerotic disease, though the pathophysiology is very different, even the fibrosis and inflammation here is ongoing. So I think it's better to not intervene in renal artery stenosis just because you see the lesion on the angiogram. So they have to be refractory to antihypertensive medications, or unless you have a solitary functioning kidney. And as we saw from the meta-analysis, again, the approach would be to rather just balloon dilate in these patients rather than putting in a stent into the renal artery. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Over to you, Edwin.
Usual is like whether the covered versus non-covered in coarctation. I think Dr. Srinivas did touch upon that. And next, another question is to Srinath is, you can keep a snare open there actually in the upper part or the lower part, so that the lower side of where you're puncturing from, so that you can quite easy to have a mark. I think it is done nowadays. I don't know whether at that time. And whether we need to put a TPI, pace the patient when we are deploying the stent. I think we routinely do a pacing before deploying the coax stenting. I usually tend to keep a pressures around 60 to 70 or less than 60 so it can have answers from first Srinath about the two options. One, whether you have to kept a open snare versus whether you did pacing.
In this case, we had not kept an open snare, sir, and pacing also. Yeah, we had not paced.
See, my approach is, I'll tell you very frankly, if you have a tight coarctation, there is no need to pace, Edwin. Only if you have a mild coarctation, a membrane if you have associated severe aortic regurgitation with pulsatile aorta, or if you are trying to stent a transverse arch, I can understand using a balloon in balloon and having a rapid ventricular pacing. Otherwise, for straightforward garden variety of coarc, don't waste your resources, you will never embolize. The stent which Srinath embolized was not because of the movement of the stent. What happened is that his proximal portion of the balloon got inflated and the distal portion did not get. Now, why this happens? When you hand crimp the stent, you disconnect the proximal from the distal aspect of the balloon. So there are two ways of doing it. One is after you crimp, you try and see whether there is a communication by using an indiflator and see whether you can do it. But that will somehow affect the profile of your entire system. So that is not a good idea. What our policy is, we also have learned it a hard way, not by embolizing, but by something like this. What we do is that we will uncover the stent, not completely. We will keep the distal portion of the balloon and even distal portion of the stent within the sheath. Use an indiflator or even a syringe to see that the proximal portion, or means distal to you, gets inflated. Only then uncover the entire stent and then do it. So I don't think that his embolization, in my opinion, his embolization was entirely because of disconnection between the proximal and the distal segment. So this is the way to overcome that.
It was a pre-mounted stent, sir.
So if it was a pre-mounted, probably their mounting technique is not correct. I was going to ask you that question.
Yes, sir.
If it was pre-mounted stent, it is still more not acceptable.
This stents we also have a day.
I completely agree. In a pre-mounted stent, who will suspect this? Even I will not do it. But if you are hand crimping it, I think this is one of the ways of preventing this kind of complication.
The company
Post-star stents are actually bad, sir. We also have had a couple of
sure this is a issue of quality control.
Exactly.
They've stopped stents,
comment,
luckily.
Sorry.
They've stopped selling stents in India, luckily.
Another comment I wanted to make on Srinivas's case. Whenever you have a case wherein there is a subclavian involved in coarctation, whether you like it or not, you must always look at the circle of Willis circulation, because you may go ahead using a bare metal stent, but you never know when the complication is going to come and when you may have to put a covered stent. If you have to put a covered stent, you must have a strategy in place, whether the circle of Willis is complete and you are not going to end up with a gangrene of the left upper limb. And you have to keep your surgeons ready in case it is not complete. Because if there is a rupture or dissection which necessitates you to use a covered stent, you cannot be caught unaware about what is happening above. So it is a routine practice of ours. Whenever coarct involves the left subclavian, we will always take a look at the circle of Willis circulation and tell our surgeon accordingly. And the second comment I wanted to make on your case was that you showed the measurements in CT scan. I think pulsatility of the aorta is never taken into consideration in CT scan. So it's not a good idea to make measurements. You can make measurements and get some idea, but I think angiographic measurement is a must. And don't select the best image. Select the image where the diameter is maximum.
We do that, sir. CT scan is just to plan the stent strategy before we actually do the procedure. always angiography we do. This patient coincidentally had a CT scan 3 months back, actually, CT angiography, not MR angiography. So he did not have that issue. So this was some discussion was there about the preservation of the left subclavian artery. As you rightly said that it is just a matter of chance that we dissect this and we may have to use a covered stent in this patient also. There are two strategies for this, sir. One, you prophylactically implant the subclavian artery onto the carotid and cover the entire thing and do the stenting. Or you first do the covered stent and then reimplant the subclavian artery after the procedure. So this is only to actually prevent the left limb claudication and also a syncope which happens on using the left limb. Yes, of course, circle of Willis has to be patent and they should not have a limb gangrene immediately after.
As a question to Dr. Anand, do you really always wait for the inflammatory markers to come down before you proceed with ballooning, probably not stenting, obviously?
No, that's the point I was trying to make, that when patients actually come in so sick, you actually can't wait on intervening in such patients.
Yeah.
And secondly, the inflammatory markers that we actually look at, that is with ESR and CRP, which is most often available. We don't really do any of the fancy ones. They can very well be normal even when there is activity.
But Anand, you have to give in one thing, is that if you are going to intervene in patients with high C-reactive protein and ESR, be ready for aortic rupture someday. Believe me.
Yes, sir.
This is one intervention where I say my prayers 3 times before going.
True.
If you are going to intervene in aortoarteritis in acute inflammatory state, I've not done it, but I have seen somebody else doing it and rupturing aorta, and there is no salvaging that patient. He is dead.
True.
So my this thing is that I agree they are very sick and everything, but I think if you are going to intervene, you have to be very, very careful. Have a load of covered stents ready, and if you are going to be in thoracoabdominal aorta involving the superior mesenteric, celiac, and all, you have to have such a surgical backup in case of any obstruction. They will be able to manage this patient.
True.
Yeah.
And the only comment I wanted to make on that patient with interruption is that when you have an interruption, using a bare metal stent is not a good strategy. If there are economic consideration, don't do it. But you will burn yourself, and the amount of adrenaline you require to put a bare metal stent in somebody who has an interruption is really high. If you end up with pseudoaneurysm, or a young patient just dropping dead somewhere is not a great idea. So I think whenever you are doing interruption, you have to have a covered stent ready. There's no way you can get out of that. At least that is what I feel. I'm not sure what other people feel. But I think you should have that.
Good to have one, but nowadays the limited stent availability, many of them just delay and postpone the procedure per se itself. That is. But most of the time we have got away with the non-covered stent. Don't know. We
But
always
in interruption,
keep it. Yeah, 2. I've done 3, but I've got away all 3 with non-covered, because 2 cases in which it was very close to the subclavian. That's almost similar to one we did it and that Dr. Srinivas had shown. We did in 2009, I think, with Dr. Shakil, one case in which we finally had, me and Dr. Kannan did one. The difficulty in crossing, finally after almost 1 hour of struggle, we crossed it. But almost always have a covered stent ready. But as you said, even will there be enough time for a covered stent to be tracked up itself? It will be before that, patient will be very likely to be exsanguinated if you are rupturing aorta.
And I think the period where you did this stent with this vascular concept, there was not many options available at that time. So there was either vascular concept stent or you had a CT stent which was damn expensive. Right now, the situation for using a covered stent is actually much better. You can still get good quality covered stent at not so much different prices. So given an option, I would always use a covered stent in this.
Yeah, it should definitely. I think we are, Dr.
coarctation is one intervention where there are maximum number of lawsuits in United States. It is one of the most, gratifying interventions. But if you land up in a problem, it can be a very major mess, And salvaging those patients is very, I'm not saying if you have a covered stent means you have license to do what you want. I mean, definitely, even with a covered stent, you have to be gentle with the tissues and use some basic principles of intervention. But not having it can put you in a dire state of emergency. That is a word of caution.
In a post-op case, probably you will be safe in trying this because you have a fibrosis there. But in a de novo patient, probably it's not a great idea to do it without a covered stent. I think we are quite late. Dr. Dalvi, we want to wind up the session unless it's already we are far beyond our time limits.
I think I would conclude this session by thanking all the speakers. They have done a great job. And thanking Edwin, of course, to take initiative and coordinate so many people, and my co-panelists and everyone on the in the audience who took their time out to listen to us and to exchange ideas, ask questions. So thank you once again and have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good night.